Okay, so now that we've covered the politics of this time period, now we're going to move into the social reforms and actions during the age of the common man. So, society, culture, reform, this will be the first half of this idea. So first comes the Second Great Awakening. Remember that the First Great Awakening was happening about the time of the Enlightenment and all that was going on. Now the Second Great Awakening is this religious revivals that swept through the early decades of the 19th century. It was a reaction to the rationalism, the belief in human reasoning from the Enlightenment and the Revolution, and the rise of Calvinism. Calvinism began a counterattack against the liberal views of the Enlightenment and the Revolution in the 1790s because it was a populist religion which said that everyone had the opportunity for salvation, and this was attuned to the democratization of American society. You have this rise of Unitarians who believed in a God of love instead of a God of anger, and everybody could go to heaven through good works and through helping others. The idea of a social conscience where the social gospel and applying Christ's teachings to bettering society. The Great Awakening sparked a lot of interest that the individual could control their destiny and that their good deeds would make the nation a better place. These revivals were sermons that appealed to people's emotions and their fear of damnation or going to hell. The Baptists and the Methodists were the largest groups during this time, and they had circuit preachers that had camp meetings or outdoor revivals to preach these messages of salvation by grace and getting to heaven through Christ. Society during the Jacksonian era was undergoing deep and rapid change, as we talked about with the politics last time. The revolution in markets brought both economic expansion and periodic depression, so a lot of people were looking for some stability in their lives. So combating this uncertainty, reformers sought this stability and this order in religion. So religion provided a means of social control in this disordered society. Churchgoers were embracing the values of hard work, punctuality, sobriety, meaning not drinking. Revivals brought unity and strength and this sense of peace to the people. So as a result of the Second Great Awakening, the dominant form of Christianity in America became evangelical Protestantism. So think about, you hear about this in the news all the time right now, evangelicals and blah, blah, blah. Well, this is where the roots came from in the Second Great Awakening. Membership in the major Protestant churches, the Congregational, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches soared. By 1840, about half of the adult population was connected to some church, with the Methodists coming out as the largest denomination in both the North and the South. Baptist theory or theology was grounded in biblical fundamentalism, that there was a certainty that every word and story in the Bible was divinely inspired by God and literally true. They believed that everyone could get their salvation, to go to heaven, by choosing through their free will to receive God's grace and being baptized as adults. It stressed the social equality of all before God, regardless of wealth, status, or education. So this appealed to a lot of people. The Methodists believed in free will, developed the most effective evangelical method, which is why they became the most popular in the North and the South. These traveling evangelists who sought their converts in remote frontier settlements, they obviously won out because they were passing along a good message for them. The Presbyterians and the Congregationalists agreed on the theology, and they were able to form unified congregations where they were able to call ministers from either denomination to serve them. Eventually, the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians merged. So there's that too. Charles Finney was the most successful evangelist in New York. He conducted his own revivals in the mid-1820s and early 1830s. He rejected the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, saying that it was predetermined before you were born whether you're going to heaven or hell, and he adopted the ideas of free will and salvation for all. It really popularized this new form of revival, this meeting at night after night to build excitement, speaking bluntly to people, praying for sinners by name, encouraging women to testify in public, and placing those that were struggling with conversion on the anxious bench at the front of the church. This was attracted to more prosperous seekers, basically aimed at the highest classes of society. Charles Finney wanted religion to be aimed towards them. Millennialism was this belief that the world was about to end with the second coming of Jesus. So they believed that Jesus was coming on October 21st, 1844. They created the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Members sold their belongings, bought white robes for their ascension into heaven, and the believers formed this Seventh-day Adventist Church on October 22nd after the second coming didn't come. The Mormons, so their official name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were founded by Joseph Smith in the 1830s. Joseph Smith traced a connection between the American Indians and the lost tribes of Israel. In 1827, Smith announced that he had discovered a set of tablets on which was written the Book of Mormon, and he proclaimed he had a commission from God to reestablish the true church. Because of his unorthodox teachings, he was killed by an anti-Mormon mob. Brigham Young, Smith's successor as the leader of the church, led the Mormons westward in 1846 to 47 over to Utah to live and worship without interference. I'll show you a map on the next slide. Like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening was widening the gaps between the classes and the religions. If you look at the map here, you can see where the Mormons started in New York, and they made their way west all the way over to Salt Lake City, where the seat of the Mormon Church rests today. Absolutely beautiful buildings. I went there a couple of years ago. The temple is beautiful. The whole temple square is gorgeous, and the Mormons do a lot to further ancestral research and stuff like that. So I highly recommend it if you ever get the chance to go out to Salt Lake. During this time, you also have the rise of African American churches. This revivalism also spread to African American communities. The Second Great Awakening has been called the central and defining event for the development of Afro-Christianity. So during these revivals, the Baptists and the Methodists converted large numbers of Black people. This led to the formation of all Black Methodist and Baptist churches, mostly in the North. Let's be real, in the South, they're not really doing that. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, had over 17,000 members by 1846, which is incredible. That was based in Philadelphia. So the Second Great Awakening was this spiritual reform from within, and this led to the idea of fixing society and redefining the ideal of equality. So you see temperance, which is dealing with alcohol, asylum and penal reform for jails, abolitionism, women's rights, and education. So transcendentalists. Transcendentalism means liberation from understanding and the cultivation of reasoning. They wanted to transcend the limits of intellect and allow the emotions and the soul to create an original relationship with the universe. So it was based on American culture, not European culture, and a focus on being strongly American. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, he wrote essays and letters that express the individualistic and nationalistic spirit of Americans and focus on that distinctive American culture. Emerson was a Northerner and a strong abolitionist as well. Henry David Thoreau was another transcendentalist who believed in living simply in the woods. He wrote Walden, and he also wrote on civil disobedience. He established himself as an early advocate of nonviolent protest. He was a pioneer ecologist and conservationist as well. During this time, you also have this idea of finding a utopia or perfect society. So you have these communal experiments starting at this time. The Shakers, so they were called Shakers because of the manifestations of visions and prophecies that evolved into ritual dances. They believed that God was a dual personality, Christ was masculine, and Mother Anne, the founder, was feminine. They had 6,000 members in various communities. They held their property in common, and they kept men and women separate. They forbid marriage and sexual relations. they died out because of their lack of new recruits. Obviously, if you're not having more kids, it's harder to continue a community. The Amana colonies were in Iowa, and they were Germans who belonged to the religious movement Pietism, and they believed in simple communal living, and they allowed marriage. They prosper still today, although they no longer practice communal ways of living like they did back in the 1800s. The New Harmony community was a non-religious experiment in New Harmony, Indiana. They hoped to provide an answer to the problems of inequity and alienization that were caused by the Industrial Revolution. They failed largely due to financial problems and disagreements between members of the community. The Oneida community in New York shared property and marriage partners. They believed in complex marriage, that every man in the community was married to every woman and vice versa. They coined the term free love, and they prospered because of the production and sale of silverware in excellent quality. The Fourier phalanxes were influenced by French socialist Charles Fourier, and advocated that people share work and housing in their communities, but Americans proved too individualistic to live communally in those communities. So the communal experiments that you can see, most of them were in the north, a few of them were in the west, but you can see on this map where individual communities were located. As for arts and literature, you have a rise in painting, genre painting, like painting the everyday life of ordinary people. George Caleb Bingham, William S. Mount were part of the Hudson River School, and part of this genre painting idea. The Hudson River School was dramatic scenes along the Hudson River in New York. Thomas Cole and Frederick Church were known for their works of the Hudson River School. So if you look at these paintings, on the left is a painting by Thomas Cole called The Oxbow, View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm in 1836. You can see it's a focus on nature and a realistic view of nature. If you look at the bottom image, Frederick Church painted Niagara Falls in 1857. Again, a very realistic nature-based painting. There's this idea in literature and painting at this point to bring it back to reality and bring it back to nature, especially after the Enlightenment and all of these grand ideas of the Revolution. Architecture was inspired by the democracy of classical Athens. They glorified the democratic spirit of the Republic. A lot of columned facades, which you can see demonstrated here. Top right is the plan for the rotunda at UVA, fashioned after the Roman Pantheon. The White House and the Capitol building as well. So you can see the columns that were important in this spirit of democracy. These columned facades graced the entryways to public buildings, banks, hotels, and even some private homes as well. Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper wrote fiction using these American settings as opposed to European settings. Nathaniel Hawthorne questioned intolerance and conformity in American life. He had ancestors that were Puritans, and one of his ancestors actually had been a judge at the Salem witch trials. So his focus kind of makes sense if you think about it through the lens of Puritanism, where he focused on sin and its consequences, pride and selfishness, secret guilt, and the impossibility of rooting sin out of the human soul. Pretty dark stuff there. Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. He actually lived on whaling ships, and he helped complete a mutiny at one point as well. So he wrote what he knew. He reflected theological and cultural conflicts of the era in his writings. And other literary giants of the time period include Emily Dickinson, who was a poet. She believed in solitary existence. She was unmarried. And she often wrote about abstract themes like life, death, fear, loneliness, nature, a withdrawal of God and not being able to find him. Edgar Allan Poe happened to be fascinated by death. He wrote The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Pit and the Pendulum. I could go on and on. Again, fascinated by death. If you ever get the chance to read his stuff, do. It's amazing. Really dark, though. Walt Whitman was a New York journalist and poet, and he wrote excitedly about industrialization. So he was different than the other literary giants of the period. Other literary giants kind of shied away from industrialization and focused back on nature and the abstract. He was really thrilled about industrialization and urban life and working men and sailors and just the simple idea of humanity.